Hey everybody. I wanted to share this chapter from part 3 of the Kayfabe series, both as a sneak preview for those of you who've been patiently waiting.
It's been 84 years.
And because I think the model described here deserves its own standalone video. This chapter comes about halfway through the episode, right after the one on the Great Awakening, and right before the one on the 2016 election. One quick point, I'll describe them in much greater detail in the full episode, but in addition to embedded growth obligations, you'll also hear 2 more pieces of Weinstein jargon in the video. One is the GIN,
the gated institutional narrative,
and the other is the DISC,
the distributed idea suppression complex.
You can check out more detail on what these mean in the links in the description below. Okay, without further ado, enjoy this preview of Part 3, Reality Shoots.
So the other thing we want to talk about, of course, is that you and I have been trying to make the case, I have anyway, that liberals need to stand up for liberal principles.
Yeah, well, liberals have really failed on the topic of theocracy. They'll criticize white theocracy, they'll criticize Christians, but when you want to talk about the treatment of women and homosexuals and free thinkers and public intellectuals in the Muslim world, I would argue that liberals have failed us.
Thank God you're here.
Yeah.
Remember this? If you're like me, it probably lingers in your mind as one of the clearest examples of a pattern that's become all too common since. Someone attempts to carefully explain a heterodox opinion on a controversial topic, in this case the unique dangers of fundamentalist Islam, and what they get back is, well...
It's gross, it's racist.
It's not,
it's like saying those
so not your
shifty Jew.
What's less commonly understood is how this pattern fits into the larger story we've been telling, about how, and now I finally get to use all the acronyms at once, the DISC protects the GIN from things that threaten the egos. Let's take a look at Weinstein's model for how this works.
I introduced this thing called the Four Quadrant Model.
Imagine that the x-axis represents opposition or support for a position favored within the GIN. For example, the claim that there's no special link between jihadist violence and the doctrines of Islam. Though not always explicit, these views shape the boundaries of the discourse and serve as tripwires for those who transgress them.
What is your ask?
No,
Just condemn Islam?
The solution. No.
Suppose that the y-axis represents moral virtue and moral vice, either benign motives or nefarious ones. These two axes create 4 quadrants, 4 ideal types that show up in these kinds of altercations. Let's walk through them in detail. In the first quadrant are what Weinstein calls the Dupes, or ivy-covered dupes. These are generally cultural elites, often well-educated at top schools, who support the position based on its idealistic moral justification. They're the foot soldiers, the ones who model and enforce the boundaries of right opinion.
Hold on, are you the person who understands the officially codified doctrine of Islam?
These are people who think that they are the elite, but they're not really in control, and they don't realize that they are in fact being propagandized. And it's very difficult to work with this because they're convinced that they're the ones in the know.
That's just a fact.
Like blasphemy.
It's not a fact. It's an ugly
apostasy.
The second quadrant is comprised of contrarians and independent thinkers, often coming from outside the institutional mainstream. These are people who oppose the GIN's position, but not for the morally suspect reasons that the Dupes allege.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people, and that's a problem.
But in trying to reason through issues from first principles, they eventually run afoul of the GIN's sacred cows and say something adjacent to something dangerous.
But Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So we have.
That brings us to the third quadrant, where the smoke of dangerous sounding ideas genuinely signals the fire of nefarious motives. These are the Troglodytes, the actual bigots and racists that the Dupes are always in search of. The steady supply of such people is what gives the moralizing narrative of the GIN its force. But the crucial thing to understand is that within the gated institutional narrative, and consequently for the Dupes whose worldview it shapes, only these 2 quadrants exist. Smoke always means fire. That's why whenever they encounter someone thinking off script from up here, they frantically accuse them of a position from down here.
You don't understand my argument.
Your argument is like, black people, they show each other.
That is not an argument.
Another especially clear example of this was when Jordan Peterson spoke to Cathy Newman a few years later.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution.
You're saying that women aren't intelligent enough to run these top companies?
No, I didn't say that at all.
Well, you were saying that intelligence
female
and conscientious by implication are not female traits.
No,
I mean, that's very dangerous territory.
I'm not saying that at all.
The question is how these caricaturish positions ever became so dominant in the first place, and why it's so important to paint those who challenge them as beyond the pale. And that brings me to the fourth quadrant, what Weinstein calls the rent-seeking elite.
Rent-seeking is the ultimate insult from an economist. It says that you're trying to profit without really producing anything.
These are people who support the jin's position because it protects their economic interests. But because those interests often involve something nefarious, they have to be sold with idealistic cover stories that are beyond reproach. As we've been discussing throughout the series, over the past 50 years, an increasing share of economic activity has been devoted to rent-seeking and gimmicks. That is, plans for growth that depend on transferring wealth from fellow citizens or from the future. At the same time, the absence of underlying scientific and technological progress has made these plans more and more desperate and tenuous. The increasing absurdity of the jin's positions reflects the increasing fragility and corruption of the system. It's not an accident that the view that Islam has nothing to do with terror took hold in a nation dependent on Saudi oil. Nor is it an accident that untenable views about male-female sameness grew up as wage stagnation made it impossible to support a family on a single income. Wherever such ridiculous ideas hold sway, someone's ego is being protected. To take just one more example, consider the topic of immigration. Here, the position of the Dupes is that immigration is a universal good, whether or not they'd explicitly endorse open borders. In the second quadrant, you might find someone like Weinstein or the economist George Borjas, both of whom argue that immigration is often used to redistribute wealth.
Immigration basically hurts people who compete with immigrants, and people who use immigrants, whether it be employers or consumers or upper middle class Californians who have a gardener and a maid and so on, those are the people who gain from immigration. So it's really redistribution of wealth at heart.
But within the jinn, the only reason to be opposed to immigration is xenophobia, or one or another species of bigotry.
You can't have that conversation about the misuse of immigration as a tool of transfer, because our media will instantly set upon you and say, well, the only reason you're talking about restricting immigration is your hatred of foreigners and you can't disguise it from me.
So you cannot be a xenophilic restrictionist. So
right.
that cannot exist. By definition, it cannot exist.
Right.
Of course, ensuring that all criticism of immigration be viewed as xenophobia serves the interests of those who want to import cheap labor at the expense of native workers. These are the rent seekers. But the especially pernicious thing about this narrative is that it pushes people without expertise into the troglodyte quadrant. Someone who knows the story he's being told about immigration is a lie might come to hate immigrants themselves for lack of a clearer picture of who to blame. All the better for the rent seekers, who can continue to affirm that only troglodytes would oppose them. In 2012, fully 43.4% of Americans wanted to decrease immigration, while only 14.3% wanted it increased. This at a time when neither the political establishment nor the mainstream media were hosting substantive critiques of immigration. But if careful critiques couldn't break through the narrative, a wrecking ball eventually would.
We're going to build the wall, okay, believe me. We're going to build the wall.